once again underscored the critical role of UNRWA, whose teams vaccinated 43% of the children reached on the first day. It is now critical that the parties continue to respect the agreed humanitarian pauses and that access be granted throughout Gaza to ensure that we can reach all children in need of the vaccine, including in the north. As we have previously said, the success of the polio campaign shows what can be achieved when obstacles to humanitarian access are removed. Madam President, the level of suffering in Gaza defies our ability to capture it in words or even to comprehend its scale. Reality is brutal in Gaza, and it gets worse every day as the bombs continue to fall, as fierce fighting continues unabated, and as supplies essential for people's survival and humanitarian assistance are blocked at every turn. International humanitarian law must be respected, and this Council and all member states must exert all their influence to ensure it. Civilians must be protected, and their essential needs must be met, whether they move or stay. Civilians must be allowed to seek protection elsewhere, and they must be guaranteed the right to voluntarily return as international law demands. The wounded and sick must receive the care they need, and hospitals and medical personnel must be protected. Humanitarian operations must be facilitated both into and throughout Gaza, including to the north, to reach all civilians in need. Hostages must be immediately released, and until they are, they must be allowed visits by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Indiscriminate rocket fire towards Israel must stop. The provisional orders and determinations of the International Court of Justice must be respected. There must be accountability for international crimes. The atrocities in Gaza must end, but this cannot happen through words. It must happen through action, urgent, unequivocal action. We renew our call for urgent diplomatic efforts from across the international community to de-escalate the situation, ensure respect for international law, achieve an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, and agree a path towards sustainable peace. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Msuya for her briefing. I will now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President.
I extend my deepest gratitude to the Swiss presidency for scheduling this meeting swiftly. We have convened today again because the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, particularly in the northern region of the Strip, who has reached a catastrophic level. While the international community celebrates today the World Food Day, Palestinians in Gaza are struggling to find food, basic food. Their present marked by suffering and deprivation, and their future uncertain. I thank USG Msuya for her sober briefing that serve as yet another harrowing testimony from the humanitarian community. It lays plain the stark reality on how the Israeli occupying authorities are not merely disregarding international humanitarian law, but are trampling upon the very essence of human decency. For over a year now, the Palestinian people, especially those in Gaza, have endured suffering beyond imagination. It appears that the sadistic impulses of those responsible within the Israeli authorities knows no bounds when it comes to inflicting torment, inflicting punishment upon the Palestinian civilians. Civilians that must not be a military target. They are protected by the international law. The Israeli occupying power should fulfill its obligation in this regard. Especially the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is explicitly prohibited under international humanitarian law. This prohibition extends to depriving civilians of objects necessary for survival and impeding relief supply. Surprisingly, the second vaccination campaign that commenced on October 14 reached more than 157 children on its first 2 days alone. So, how is it possible? How is it possible that we can vaccinate these children, yet we cannot feed them? How can we secure trucks transporting vaccines, but not those carrying essential food? The inevitable conclusion is that this is not a collateral damage, but a deliberate, calculated Israeli policy of starvation of the Palestinian people. Madam President, the International Court of Justice, in its provisional measures, ordered Israel, the occupying power, to, and I quote, take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. End of quote. This Council, through Resolution 2728, explicitly reiterate its demand for the lifting of all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance at scale. The response from the Israeli occupying power has been nothing short of disdainful. Closure of crossing point, increasing restriction on access, and the immoral use of starvation as a method of warfare. When we last convened on October 9th, last week, we raised alarms about the state of humanitarian assistance, noting that September, this last month of September, saw the lowest levels of aid since October of the previous year. We then expressed grave concern over the behavior of the Israeli occupying authorities, who denied or impeded nearly 80% of humanitarian movement between northern and southern Gaza in September. The response of the Israeli authority to our concern? More restriction, more killing of Palestinian civilians. Yesterday alone, 68 of them. In the past week alone, a mere 6 trucks per day have been permitted to enter Gaza. A number so paltry, it borders on the absurd, given the scale of need. Before the crisis, I want to remind that there were more than 500 trucks per day. Madam President, the occupying powers' disregard for Palestinian lives doesn't stop there. They have escalated their tactics, adding new depth of cruelty to their actions. On the night of October 13th, they struck tents in the vicinity of Al-Aqsa Mosque, Al-Aqsa Hospital. The result? At least 4 people burned to death. Burned to death. Yes, you heard correctly. Burned to death. This is the occupiers' perverse demonstration of how sacred they consider human life. They consider Palestinians' life. The situation stands on the brink of further deterioration, with the potential adoption of legislation by the occupying power, halting UNRWA operations. Such acts would strip Gazans of the backbone of humanitarian actions and further complicate the United Nations humanitarian mission. Madam President, it is clear that the Israeli authorities are not listening to anyone. Not the ICG, not the General Assembly, not this very council, not even their closest allies, but this Security Council has the authority and possess the tools to ensure the enforcement of its decision. The time has come for decisive action. The lives of countless civilians, Palestinian civilians, hang in the balance. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I also want to thank Acting Under-Secretary General Ms. Suja for her briefing today. Slovenia is a country established on the principle of self-determination. Despite our celebration of independence, a siege is not a foreign word to us. Our capital was under siege during the Second World War for 3 years. In our region, the siege of Sarajevo during the conflict in the 90s was the longest lasting total siege in the contemporary European history. We can associate with the siege and indiscriminate bombing and people being killed in line for food or population without food, medicine, gas, electricity, and water, population deprived of human dignity. Back then, we declared never again. A siege is not a foreign word to Palestinians. Gaza has been not only under occupation, but under a siege for years, for decades. What we are hearing and witnessing today about Israeli government attitude towards the northern Gaza is a siege within a siege, a total siege of starved and traumatized civilians. Colleagues, this Council has met many times. With a number of meetings we had, Slovenia avoids repeating what our briefers share with us. So today I want to be clear with our messages. We call for an immediate ceasefire. We call for immediate release of hostages. We call for lifting of all barriers to delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. We call for basic humanitarian aid, food, water, fuel, medicine, hygiene material, basic things to be delivered at scale. We call for urgent delivery of winter supplies, again, basic items like proper shelters, warm clothes, and blankets. We call for immediate restoration of food systems and basic services. We call for opening all available routes to and throughout the entire Gaza Strip, including of border crossings to provide humanitarian assistance to all those in need. We call for immediate and sustained access of UN missions to the north. We call for protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, schools, displacement sites, and healthcare facilities. We call for an end to attacks on healthcare and for addressing critical shortages of essential medicines and equipment. We call for an end to forced displacement, including through evacuation orders. We call for special protection to be granted to women, children, persons with disabilities, older persons, and other persons in vulnerable situations. We call for a fully functioning deconfliction mechanism to ensure safety and humanitarian operations. We call for protection of humanitarian and health workers, including with access to appropriate protection equipment. We call for safety, security, and respect of United Nations, its personnel, and its premises. We call for withdrawal of legislation of UNRWA, which would collapse humanitarian operations in Palestine. We call for respect of international law, particularly international humanitarian law and human rights law. We call for full implementation of Security Council resolutions and ICJ provisional orders, which are binding and must be implemented. We call for end of impunity. We call for accountability. We call for security of Israelis and Palestinians. We call for resumption of a meaningful and time-bound political process leading to two-state solution. We call for upholding of the UN Charter, also by this Council. We call for peace. So, colleagues, we will not forget Gaza, and we will not lose hope for this Council to speak with one voice. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant.
I thank the representative of Slovenia. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam President, at the outset, I express my appreciation to you for responding to the Algerian request to meet with a swiftness matching the urgency of the matter under consideration. I also thank Ms. Msuya for her sobering briefing. Madam President, dear colleagues, each time we meet in the Security Council to discuss the situation in Gaza, we tally the miseries and the unprecedented, including the Palestinians killed, maimed, displaced, orphaned, starved, and detained. And we deplore, demand, and condemn, as we should. We felt that the Council had fulfilled its moral and legal duty by adopting 4 resolutions because they are legally binding and hence would have brought positive change for the people of Palestine and Israel. We supported all efforts toward a deal, hoping that we will have a ceasefire, release of the hostages and Palestinians illegally detained, and a renewed hope for Palestinians, even in this darkest of times. 1 year and 47 meetings later in this chamber, our combined efforts have not had the expected results, and the situation in Gaza continues to worsen with each passing day. We must not allow the shredding of the moral and legal thread that holds our organization together. The most fundamental question, then, that this Council faces is what will we do to stop this tide? Honest answers to this question, with strong political will, would no doubt engender the kind of action needed to save the lives of the millions of civilians in Gaza and in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, who have no escape. Guyana continues to be outraged by the suffering that the government of Israel is inflicting on the civilian population in Gaza and the inhumane conditions under which they have been forced to live. This undesirable situation is compounded by the frequent evacuation orders that have become a staple of this war, and which Guyana concludes is part of a strategy to entrench instability and destroy any semblance of permanence. Displaced civilians face many hardships, including protection risks, food insecurity, and increased risk of disease. In fact, these risks are multiplied for civilians in Gaza, since many of them have been displaced multiple times since this war began last October. Madam President, international humanitarian law contains clear provisions about the forced displacement of civilian population in war. It is illegal. In the strictly limited cases where evacuation of the civilian population is permissible, the provisions are equally clear on the conditions under which the evacuation is to be carried out. Civilians' interests must be prioritized at all times, and their safety must never be compromised. Israel has not fulfilled any of its obligations in this regard. Its latest forcible displacement of civilians in the northern Gaza governorate, coupled with its siege of the area, is unconscionable, inhumane, and illegal. Civilians are so tired of their misery that many in northern Gaza who are being displaced again have decided to stay. So if they are killed, whether by bombs or by starvation, they would have at least died in the place they called home. These are the stark choices that people are now making. Guyana condemns these actions by Israel and calls for adherence to its obligations under international humanitarian law regarding the treatment of civilians in armed conflict. Madam President, these frequent evacuation orders also have a negative impact on humanitarian operations in the territory, since humanitarian personnel are forced to constantly be on the move and to re-establish themselves in new spaces, all without security guarantees. This further exacerbates the dire humanitarian situation. Against this backdrop, Guyana underscores the following 3 points. First, the International Court of Justice has unequivocally declared the illegality of Israel's ongoing occupation, and the General Assembly has demanded that Israel bring to an end its unlawful occupation of the Palestinian territories. It is therefore illegal for the Israeli government to move to annex territory in the Gaza Strip. Guyana condemns Israel's actions in this regard. Second, there is a veritable genocide taking place in Gaza. The International Court of Justice ordered Israel to take actions to prevent genocide in Gaza in accordance with that member state's obligations under the Geneva Conventions. Israel, however, continues to blatantly disregard the ICJ's orders. In this circumstance, consideration must be given to how the Council could facilitate implementation of the ICJ orders. The floodgates have already opened in Gaza, and this Council must agree to pull the plug and stand up for Palestinians. Third, this Council has the mandate and responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. We have tools at our disposal to carve out solutions to end this war. Let us use them. When legally binding resolutions and countless appeals to conscience and morality fail to change behavior, the hand of justice must be applied. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President, for convening this meeting as requested by Algeria. I also like to thank Ms. Joyce Musoya for a very sobering briefing. The recent developments in the Gaza Strip, particularly in the north, have once again alarmed the world as Israel intensifies its attacks on the besieged area. It has been a year of immense suffering for the population of Gaza, with collective punishment, use of starvation as a weapon of war, multiple displacement with no access to shelter, health care, and school for the pupils and students. Living in Gaza has meant enduring death, destruction, and untold human suffering. Before this escalation, humanitarian experts had already reported a decrease in aid entering Gaza since August 2024. The rise in violence has worsened the situation, with aid to the north blocked for nearly 10 days, an alarming violation of international humanitarian law and Security Council Resolution 2417, which condemns the use of starvation as a weapon of war. Madam President, reports from the field indicate that around 50,000 people have been displaced from the Jabalia area. Civilians face an impossible choice: either obey evacuation orders, experiencing multiple displacements, or stay and face starvation. Both options fall short of the protections required by international humanitarian law. The situation in Gaza is perilous, with nowhere truly safe. In the last 72 hours, an UNRWA school sheltering 6,200 displaced persons was shelled. Additionally, an Israeli airstrike hit the courtyard of Al-Aqsa Hospital, causing a fire at a nearby camp. 4 people died, and at least 40, including women and children, were severely injured. The destruction of the UNRWA school halted the polio vaccination drive, placing tens of thousands of vulnerable children at further risk. A humanitarian cessation of hostilities is needed for the vaccine drive to recommence and continue, and we call for this to happen. Meanwhile, the situation in the West Bank remains tense, with ongoing reports of civilian casualties. Sierra Leone condemns all attacks on civilians, including medical personnel, journalists, and humanitarian workers. These tragedies are traumatic for observers, but they are far worse for the civilians who live through them every day. This war has resulted in egregious human rights abuses, and the scars, especially for children, will be lasting. These children know nothing but violence and bloodshed. This cannot continue, and Sierra Leone renews its call for the following. First, an immediate ceasefire across all of the occupied Palestinian territory and the region. This call must be repeated until the parties recognize their moral and legal obligations to end the violence and pursue peace. This call is also to remind us in the Council on our UN Charter obligation to impose a permanent ceasefire. Second, we call for the opening of all entry points into Gaza to allow for the safe, unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid. Humanitarian personnel and convoys must be respected and protected under international humanitarian law and Security Council resolutions. We call in this regard the various provisional measures of the International Court of Justice in the application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, binding on the parties, in particular Israel, to maintain open the Rafah crossing for unhindered provision at scale of urgent needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. Third, we emphasize the need to uphold international law, including international humanitarian law, the UN Charter, and the recent ICJ advisory opinion. Unbiased application of these frameworks is essential to ending impunity and ensuring accountability. Furthermore, we stress the importance of a negotiated settlement through established diplomatic channels. In light of this, we call for the immediate implementation of Resolution 2735, which provides a foundation for an inclusive peace deal. In closing, Sierra Leone remains committed to a vision of a peaceful Middle East where Israel and Palestine exist as two independent states living side by side in peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd also like to express my appreciation to Acting USG Joyce Msuya for her updates. The Republic of Korea is gravely alarmed by the rapidly deteriorating situation in northern Gaza, particularly near the Jabalia refugee camp, which is subject to intensified attacks, and what appears to be the implementation of a long-standing plan to isolate and besiege the area. Despite the repeated calls for the protection of civilians and ensuring humanitarian aid, deliberate actions that disregard the principles of international humanitarian law continue unabated. Civilians, regardless of their ability or willingness to evacuate, are entitled to protection and access to basic necessities. Madam President, sadly, in this tragic conflict, not only international law, but humanity and morality have been completely disregarded. The airstrike last weekend that killed 5 children playing outside a kindergarten in Gaza City exemplifies once again, repeatedly, the negligence of humanity in Gaza. An additional evidence of this loss to humanity is the shocking reports that Israel did not allow food to enter northern Gaza for the first half of October, further aggravating an already desperate hunger situation. We must recognize and underscore that the current IDF strategy cannot guarantee the short or long-term security of Israel. Traumatizing and brutalizing entire generations of Palestinians in Gaza will only exacerbate deep-rooted resentment and hatred, laying the ground for more violence and tragedy in the future. The modern history of the Middle East tells us that battlefield gains are mere stopgaps. There is no military solution to this conflict. The recent developments and grim images we painfully see every day demonstrate the absolute need for an immediate ceasefire that halts the carnage, free the long-suffering Israeli hostages, and save the countless lives in Gaza. A ceasefire should also be the first step toward lasting peace in the region. Madam President, last month we saw the power of political will through the relative success of the first phase of polio vaccination campaign, with the second phase beginning on Monday under fire. An immediate ceasefire, or at the very least a humanitarian pause throughout Gaza, must be urgently implemented. We sincerely hope that Israel can demonstrate to the rest of the world that they have not lost humanity for their neighbors by proving that they are actually implementing necessary measures to protect civilians. Thus, we urge all parties, especially Israel, to immediately recalibrate toward peace, beginning with the ceasefire, the sole way for a durable solution to this extraordinarily merciless conflict. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea and now give the floor to the representative of France. Madam President, I thank Ms. Masuya for her briefing. As we've just heard, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic. France condemns the Israeli strikes on civilian infrastructure, and we call upon Israel to guarantee the protection of all civilians in accordance with international humanitarian law. We express our alarm at the extremely grave nature of the situation in the north of Gaza. There, the Israeli army has, for several days now, been conducting an operation. The human toll is already very heavy. Almost 300 victims and 100 people have been wounded in a week, according to local authorities. The delivery of aid is hampered. New evacuation orders have been issued, despite the fact that any forced displacement would constitute a grave violation of international law. Israeli authorities must lift the obstacles hindering the delivery of aid. Access has never been as restricted as since the start of the conflict. France calls upon Israel to cease projects aiming to criminalize UNRWA's activities and to prevent the office from operating in the OPTs in their entirety. That would only worsen a humanitarian situation which is already catastrophic. We reaffirm our support for UNRWA as well as for the implementation of the recommendations contained in the Colonna report. War in Gaza must stop now. That is the only way of effectively responding to the humanitarian tragedy underway. We can no longer accept that humanitarian tragedy as an inevitable fact. There needs to be an immediate permanent ceasefire, the release of all hostages, as well as the delivery at scale of humanitarian aid. France has relentlessly condemned the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the 7th of October 2023. We continue our efforts to implement the two-state solution, and we will continue to work on this task, including within the Security Council. Measures aiming to weaken the Palestinian Authority must stop. France calls upon Israel to stop hindering the transfer of Palestinian Authority revenues. We support a Palestinian Authority which is reformed and able to shoulder its responsibilities across the Palestinian territory in its entirety, including in the Gaza Strip. We must also address the war currently playing out in Lebanon. The humanitarian situation is worsening as a result of the intensification of Israeli strikes. There too, we need to see an immediate ceasefire. It is high time to fully and comprehensively implement Resolution 1701 to achieve a long-term solution along the Blue Line, which would guarantee respect for the security of both Israel and Lebanon. Finally, and above all, we must avoid a regional conflagration. In this connection, France condemned Hezbollah's attack against a military base in Binyamana, which claimed the lives of 4 people and wounded several tens of people. We recall our unwavering commitment to Israel's security. Hezbollah's attacks against Israeli territory must stop. I thank you. I thank the representative of France, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Acting Undersecretary General Masuya, for your sobering and detailed briefing of the situation on the ground. Colleagues, this weekend, like so many of you, like so many people around the world, I watched in horror as images from central Gaza poured across my screen. Images of what appeared to be displaced civilians burning alive following an Israeli airstrike. There are no words, simply no words to describe what we saw. Israel has a responsibility to do everything possible to avoid civilian casualties, even if Hamas was operating near the hospital in an attempt to use civilians as human shields. We've made this clear to Israel. Just as we've made clear to the Israeli government at the highest levels that it must do more to address the intolerable and catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Some recent U.S. diplomacy has been discussed in the press. For the first time in weeks, the Erez crossing in northern Gaza has reopened, and Israeli authorities have committed to allow UN trucks to enter northern Gaza through at least one other route. Several dozen trucks of aid have entered northern Gaza for the first time in several weeks. But that's not enough. Many, many more deliveries are needed, and we will continue to push for that. In southern Gaza, we understand that UN convoys will be able to use a new route pending repairs, and that the IDF has committed to take steps to help secure delivery routes against armed gangs involved in violent looting, and will do so on a sustained basis. Israel is also working with the World Food Program on a plan to improve humanitarian infrastructure across the Gaza Strip, which, if implemented, could lead to the additional delivery of desperately needed food aid. A second round of polio vaccination is also underway in the south and will soon begin in the north. It is crucial that Jabalia camp is included in this effort. Colleagues, we know that commitments must be followed through on, and that the progress we've seen since last week is insufficient. And so for our part, the United States will continue to make the following clear. Food and supplies must be surged into Gaza immediately, and there must be humanitarian pauses across Gaza to allow for vaccinations and the delivery and distribution of humanitarian aid. A quote-unquote policy of starvation in northern Gaza would be horrific and unacceptable, and would have implications under international law and U.S. law. The government of Israel has said that this is not their policy, that food and other essential supplies will not be cut off, and we will be watching to see that Israel's actions on the ground match this statement. Colleagues, we also remain gravely concerned by the evacuation orders issued by Israel in northern Gaza and are monitoring the implementation of these orders closely. Furthermore, all parties must abide by Resolution 2720 and reject any forced displacement of the civilian population, which would violate international law. And let's be clear, civilians are protected under international humanitarian law and may not be declared as combatants if they fail to evacuate. We know winter is approaching. The cold and bad weather will soon set in. 1 year into the fighting, with Hamas substantially degraded, Israeli authorities should be working with the UN and the international community on a plan for civilians to move inland. They should be facilitating, not obstructing, efforts to provide for temporary shelter, and they must restore basic services, including water, electricity, and sanitation. I repeat, the United States calls for this work to begin now. Israel must also cooperate with the UN and the international community to lay the foundation for the reconstruction of Gaza, because civilians must be allowed to return, including to northern Gaza, to rebuild their lives. That can be hard to imagine at a moment of so much suffering and pain, death and destruction. But we must continue to work toward a future where people can rebuild and where people can heal. And for that to happen, there must be a durable peace. And as we've said many times, a ceasefire with the release of all hostages could start today if Hamas, which set this conflict into motion and has no concern for the well-being of Palestinians in Gaza, would accept the deal on the table. It could happen today. Colleagues, I was devastated by the new details from Hirsch Goldberg, Poland's parents, that they shared about their son's execution. How Hirsch's limp body was found on his knees in a tunnel beneath Gaza, a bullet through his skull. How he attempted to lift up his arm, his only arm, to shield himself from the bullet that ended his promising young life. I urge some members of this council to stop turning a blind eye to Hamas's depraved deeds. Its acts of terror, its hostage-taking, its obstruction of a ceasefire deal, its use of civilians as human shields. And I urge members of this council to continue to focus on direct diplomatic initiatives that can save the lives of innocent people who did not start this war and cannot end it, but who bear the cost of it. We must all support the UN as it works with Israel to step up delivery and improve the humanitarian response efforts. This council has an important role to play, but ultimately, as I've said previously, actions on the ground more than discussions here in New York are what will bring real progress. That has been the focus of U.S. diplomacy and will continue to be our focus in the months ahead. Getting humanitarian aid in, getting hostages out, and ending this conflict. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Acting Under-Secretary General Masuya, for your briefing. President, the UK supported the call for this meeting today to discuss the urgent steps needed to address an ever-growing humanitarian tragedy in Gaza. The situation in northern Gaza is harrowing. Approximately 400,000 Gazans have been ordered to evacuate the north and move southwards to the IDF-designated humanitarian zone. Many of these people will already have been displaced, some many times over, and are desperately searching for refuge. But there are no safe places in Gaza. Just this week, we saw horrifying images following the Israeli strike on Al-Aqsa Hospital inside the IDF-designated humanitarian zone. Those who decide to move face intimidation, active fighting zones, and the threat of continued airstrikes. Those who stay face extreme hunger and appalling conditions without access to basic services or healthcare. In the first half of October, no food aid was delivered to northern Gaza, with Israeli authorities denying or impeding the vast majority of humanitarian movements between north and south. We expect October to see the least aid enter Gaza since the beginning of the conflict, lower even than September. Families in Gaza are facing a second winter with even less resilience and fewer resources. This is unconscionable. Israel must comply fully with international humanitarian law and ensure sufficient aid reaches all parts of Gaza. We also reiterate our concern at legislative proposals seeking to undermine UNRWA, which is vital to the humanitarian response in Gaza. Let me be clear. Northern Gaza must not be cut off from the south. Palestinian civilians, including those evacuated from northern Gaza, must be permitted to return to their communities and rebuild. There must be no forcible transfer of Gazans from or within Gaza, nor any reduction in the territory of the Gaza Strip. We need to see an immediate ceasefire to bring this devastating conflict to an end. President, we must also hold in the front of our minds the unthinkable suffering of the 101 hostages who remain in captivity in Gaza. Their ordeal has gone on for far too long. Once again, we call on Hamas to release the hostages immediately and unconditionally. And as we know, the suffering of the region goes beyond Gaza. We reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. All parties must take measures to avoid civilian casualties and ensure the safety and security of UNIFIL personnel. And in the West Bank, as my Foreign Secretary has said, we urge the Israeli government to take action to crack down on settler violence and to stop settler expansion on Palestinian land. That is why yesterday my government announced further sanctions against 3 illegal settler outposts and 4 organizations in order to bring accountability to those who perpetrate such heinous human rights abuses against Palestinians. President, the Palestinian people, the Israeli people, and the region as a whole deserve a better reality than the daily cycle of violence and fear to which they have become accustomed. But there is a path to peace, one which would see a safe and secure Palestinian state beside a safe and secure Israel. We urge the parties to be courageous and to take the path towards peace and a better future for their people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I thank Algeria for the initiative to convene this meeting, and thank Acting USG Msuya for her briefing. The sudden escalation of the situation between Lebanon and Israel in the past few days has caused widespread concern and worry in the international community. But the situation in Gaza is not showing any sign of stabilization, but has continued to deteriorate in the past 2 weeks. Israel has not relented its military operations in Gaza at all, but has constantly attacked and bombed schools and hospitals, completely cut off the access of humanitarian supplies in northern Gaza, and once again forcibly ordered an emergent evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people. Israeli bombing caused big fires. And in the sea of fires, some displaced Palestinian civilians were burning alive to their death. They are all human beings like us. Why, when born in Gaza, they have to suffer like this? 2 million people have been struggling on the verge of death for more than a year. How long will it take before they can see some hope to live? The Security Council showed us the responsibility to maintain peace. We have held repeated discussions, expressed sympathy, voiced our positions, and expressed concern. But these are not enough. It is unacceptable to allow the tragedy in Gaza continue to develop. And it is also unacceptable for the Security Council to continue to suspend collectively. We must regain and revitalize the authority of international humanitarian law. Using starvation as a weapon of war is a serious war crime. Humanitarian organizations are the lifeline for Gaza. It is intolerable to see them face suppression, restrictions, and even security threats. Israel must fulfill its obligations under international humanitarian law, immediately lift the blockade and restrictions on humanitarian access to the entire Gaza, and cooperate fully with the UN and other humanitarian entities to facilitate and ensure the safety of humanitarian operations such as the transportation of humanitarian supplies and polio vaccination. UNRWA is the pillar of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. China firmly opposes any smearing and suppression of the agency. We must retain and revitalize the effectiveness of the Security Council resolutions. The Council has adopted a number of resolutions regarding the situation in Gaza, explicitly calling for a ceasefire, but none of them has been effectively implemented. That has dealt a serious blow to the credibility of the entire United Nations system. Council resolutions are binding on all states and must be implemented. We support the Council in using all the options in its toolbox to ensure the implementation of its resolutions adopted. Every member has the responsibility to safeguard the effectiveness of the Council's resolutions. In this respect, we particularly hope that the United States will respond to the strong call of the international community and support further actions by the Council to bring about an immediate ceasefire. It needs to be pointed out that, according to reports since last October, the United States has provided Israel with more than $17 billion worth of military aids. Under the current circumstances, does such large-scale supply of weapons help to realize the objectives of the Security Council resolutions? This is a question that needs serious consideration. We must revitalize and safeguard the political prospects for the two-state solution. The implementation of the two-state solution and the establishment of an independent Palestinian state is the only viable way to resolve the Palestinian question. Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem are all inseparable, integral parts of the state of Palestine. The future governance arrangements for Gaza should be predicated on a full withdrawal of Israeli troops and should be decided through internal consultations among the Palestinian people. The implementation of the two-state solution requires the political will of both parties. Israel must stop eroding and jeopardizing the foundations of the two-state solution and return to the right track of the two-state solution. The international community has the responsibility to provide international guarantee for the implementation of the two-state solution, and China is ready to continue to play a constructive role and make unremitting efforts to push for a ceasefire and end to the fighting as soon as possible to realize peace in the region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I also thank Ms. Massoua for her harrowing briefing. On Monday, we witnessed shocking and disquieting images of civilians being burnt alive following the Israeli airstrikes on Al-Aqsa Hospital, where several IDPs were taking refuge. Regrettably, this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the catastrophe which is unfolding. Central Gaza alone has seen at least 2 mass casualty incidents since Sunday. In northern Gaza, the siege has intensified, cutting off food and aid to the area and forcing over 50,000 people from Jabalia camp to be displaced once more. Such levels of suffering must not be normalized or justified. The devastating consequences of this violence have exacted a heavy toll on civilians. The cost in human lives is staggering. In the last week alone, 379 Palestinians have been killed and over 1,400 injured in Gaza. These are not just statistics. They represent human beings, families, communities, and futures that have been torn apart. Malta urgently calls for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. Hostages must be released unconditionally. Humanitarian aid must be allowed to flow without obstruction. All crossing points for aid must be opened without any more delays. We strongly condemn all actions that target civilians and civilian infrastructure. It is essential that all parties, without exception, adhere to the principles of international law. They must make sure that military action and hostilities do not further entrench the suffering of civilians. No food has entered North Gaza for more than 12 days, with the World Food Programme once more warning of famine engulfing the population. The population is being deprived of basic necessities, including healthcare. Hospitals in North Gaza are operating at minimum capacity. Those being once again forcibly displaced from the north have nowhere to go, as bombardment continues across the Strip. Hospitals, schools, and places of worship are often targeted, depriving civilians of any potential sanctuary. With nowhere safe to go, we have heard that some have chosen to die at home. International humanitarian law is unequivocal. Forced displacement is prohibited. Civilians must be safeguarded at all times, and those who choose to remain in their homes must be guaranteed access to essential resources and services. Malta reiterates its call for the immediate and full implementation of the International Court of Justice's order on provisional measures, and emphasizes that international law is binding on all states. Despite the severe insecurity and violence, the second round of polio vaccines have started to be administered on Monday. We pay tribute to the brave workers from WHO, UNICEF, and UNRWA, who aim to vaccinate over 590,000 children in the coming days. We also strive to ensure that children in Gaza are protected in the long term, where not only physical care, but only psychological support will be needed. There is no actor which is better placed to ensure this than UNRWA. Yet, the agency is facing a multitude of challenges, including strikes on its premises, such as the Al-Mufti School, which was shelled on 13th October. 22 Palestinians, including 15 children, were killed in that attack. It is concerning that legislation affecting the agency is being considered by the Israeli Knesset, which is seeking to halt UNRWA's operation in the OPT, including East Jerusalem. UNRWA is a pillar of humanitarian efforts and regional stability. Without its continued presence, the consequences will be devastating for millions who rely on its services. We once again call for the shelving of this legislation to ensure that UNRWA can continue its vital work in line with its mandate adopted by the General Assembly with overwhelming majority. President, the time for rhetoric has long passed. The situation is unsustainable. The stories are heart-wrenching. The violence must end. The situation in the West Bank also remains alarming, particularly the financial situation of the Palestinian Authority, the increase in illegal settlements and settler violence, the situation of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and the threats to the long-established but fragile status quo on Jerusalem's holy sites also deserved our undivided attention. These challenges and the conflict's expansion into Lebanon may engulf the region. This Council has the tools and responsibility to act decisively and effectively. By pursuing a regional ceasefire, upholding international law, and working towards a credible and irreversible realization of the two-state solution, we can chart a path to peace that is both just and lasting. The world is watching, and we must not fail it. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta. I give the floor to Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the Switzerland's presidency for promptly convening this briefing and to Algeria for calling our collective responsibility in addressing the dire situation in Gaza. We also thank Ms. Joyce Msuya, Acting Under Secretary General, for providing comprehensive information on the latest situation in Gaza. Madam President, the Middle East region, particularly the Gaza Strip, demands the unwavering attention of this Council. The situation in Gaza has reached a critical juncture with ongoing military operations and an escalating humanitarian crisis that can no longer be ignored. Recent reports paint a harrowing picture of the northern Gaza Strip. The relentless Israel bombardment continues unabated, resulting in mounting civilian casualties and widespread destruction of infrastructure. The statement from Doctors Without Borders detailing the entrapment of their staff members in Jabalia and the reported casualties at Al-Yemen Al-Sahid Hospital underscores the dire circumstances faced by both civilians and humanitarian workers. The death toll and displacement figures in Gaza are rising at an alarming rate. The scenario described by major humanitarian actors, including the United Nations, can only be characterized as catastrophic. The evacuation orders issued for the main shelters and hospitals in Gaza, as reported by medical personnel on the ground, are terrifying. Aid workers are faced unsurmountable challenges in complying with these evacuation instructions due to ongoing hostilities. The constant threat of violence severely impedes efforts to ensure the safety passage of civilians and the delivery of essential aid. The humanitarian crisis is therefore deepening, with food and water becoming increasingly scarce. Madam President, this Council adopted Resolution 2720 in December 2023 in response to the Gaza Strip worsening humanitarian crisis. This action underscored the urgent need for immediate, safe, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian civilian population throughout Gaza. We again call upon all parties to urgently implement this critical resolution. The dire situation demands immediate and decisive international action to safeguard the lives of those affected in full accordance with relevant international norms. This Council bears the moral and the primary responsibility to act swiftly and decisively. We cannot overstate the urgency. Lives are at stake. Madam President, ceasefire is not merely necessary. It is imperative to prevent further loss of life and facilitate delivery of humanitarian aid to those in desperate need. Every moment of continued fighting exacerbates this crisis. The international community must act swiftly to bring about peaceful resolution. In light of the rapidly deteriorating situation in Gaza, we reiterate our call for the Security Council to explore viable alternatives to address this crisis. To this end, we propose the following actions. First, intensify diplomatic efforts to bring all parties to the negotiating table, engaging influential nations, including members of this Council, to leverage their influence to de-escalate the conflict. Second, demand an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire to halt all hostilities, protect civilians' lives, release hostages, and all other held in captivity. Third, establish and enforce safe and secure humanitarian corridors to ensure the delivery of essential aid and medical supplies to affected populations, including facilitating the planned second phase of polio vaccination. This necessitates the rigorous enforcement of international laws prohibiting the obstruction of aid delivery. Fourth, strengthen existing Security Council resolutions, particularly 2720, 2735, by adopting more robust and enforceable measures that mandate immediate and hindered humanitarian access to Gaza. Lastly, encourage and facilitate political dialogue between the conflicting parties to address the root causes of the conflict and work towards a sustainable peace agreement. Madam President, we hope that these actions could not only alleviate the immediate suffering of the people in Gaza and pave the way for long-term stability and peace in the region. This includes the realization of the two-state solution, which the UN Secretary General has rightly identified as the only way to avoid endless cycles of fear, hatred, and violence. The time for decisive action is now. History will judge us harshly for any further inaction in the face of this humanitarian catastrophe. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique. I give the floor to the Russian Federation. Madam President, we support Algeria's initiative to hold this Emergency Security Council meeting to discuss the unbearable humanitarian situation in the north of the Gaza Strip. We'd like to thank the acting head of OCHA, Joyce Msoya, for her overview of the human tragedy unfolding before our very eyes. Given that for over 12 months we've seen incessant bombing by Israel's Air Force, the humanitarian situation in the enclave is truly horrific. The number of people killed, wounded, and maimed, these civilians, including women and children, is staggering. In the last 24 hours alone, 55 Palestinians were killed. Over 229 were wounded. The scale of starvation is shocking. Gaza's entire population is in need of emergency food aid. Mass displacement and evacuation orders have become mundane, although there is basically nowhere left to flee. In different parts of the Strip, schools, hospitals, and refugee camps are being shelled. The US media is quoting volunteer doctors working in Gazan hospitals. According to their witness accounts, practically daily they're seeing cases of gunshot wounds to the heads among minors between the ages of 2 and 12. It would appear then that the UN flag is not only failing to protect the civilian population, humanitarian workers, and civilian social infrastructure, but this flag is also seemingly becoming a direct target for the IDF. All humanitarian workers, including today's briefer, are stating in unison that there is nowhere in Gaza that's safe. This is not a figure of speech, it's a bitter reality. Madam President, for 2 weeks now, the international community has looked on as the Israeli military has conducted intensive airstrikes and a military ground operation in the northern Gaza Strip. We're receiving reports about hundreds of Palestinians killed, including children. Just a few days ago, on the 13th of October, yet another outrageous airstrike was conducted by the Israeli Air Force on schools in the Nuseirat refugee camp. As a result, a minimum of 22 people died, including 15 children and women. 80 people received wounds to varying degrees of severity. Another 5 minors became victims of an airstrike on the Al-Shati camp in the north of the enclave. The IDP has been conducting a military operation, a siege of the Jabalia camp, for over a week now. As a result of bombing, undernourishment and thirst, hundreds of thousands of people could die. And yet the only bakery in the city of Jabalia was destructed by yet another Israeli airstrike. Over 400,000 people saw themselves cut off by the Israeli military, cut off from food and medical aid. And this at a time when the WFP is not delivering foodstuffs to the northern Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, food distribution centers were shut owing to the intensification of hostilities. Unfortunately, this is in keeping with media reports about Israel implementing a so-called general's plan of the IDF. That's a humanitarian blockade and squeezing people out from these territories. That's the plan. We really hope that this chilling information will not be corroborated. In this context, we echo the words of the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Mr. Lazzarini. He called on Israel to exhibit humanity and courage, underscoring that people in the northern Gaza Strip are facing a choice, fleeing their homes or dying of starvation. Madam President, the socioeconomic damage being done to the Strip that has been done over the last year is colossal. According to UN estimates and figures, the enclave's GDP dropped so far that recovery to pre-crisis levels will take almost 70 years. Reconstruction of critical infrastructure will require a minimum of 80 years. These calculations take as their base the start of 2024, although the mass destruction is continuing day in, day out. Unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance to Palestinians under prevailing conditions is of utmost importance. And yet here again, we're seeing serious problems. Israel is introducing restrictions. Meanwhile, humanitarian workers are themselves being shelled and detained on a regular basis. In total, over 300 humanitarian workers have been killed, making 2023 the deadliest in history for humanitarian workers. The UN is ringing alarm bells. 2024 could break a new deadly record in this respect. Hence, what does not withstand any criticism are the Knesset bills aiming to ban UNRWA work activities on Israeli territory and to revoke the immunities and privileges of UNRWA personnel. Let me remind you that the agency is the backbone of the UN's humanitarian wing in Palestine. It has unparalleled social, educational, and medical service provision capabilities. If the bills were adopted, they'd threaten not only the lives of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, but also dim the prospects of assisting Palestinian refugees in neighboring Arab countries, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. On top of the precipitously deteriorating situation in the OPT and the financial crisis prompted by the US withdrawing donor support to UNRWA, the above risks definitively spelling the end of the agency's activities. It appears that that is exactly what Israel is trying to achieve. Despite all of the above, Washington, without any regard for the opinion of the international community, is continuing to pump its Middle Eastern ally full of weapons. At the same time, the US is providing political cover and blocking any Security Council attempts to end Israel's ruthless military machine responsible for numerous crimes against the Palestinian people. Madam President, such unilateral and unpunished actions taken to create irreversible facts on the ground are a flagrant violation of Israel's obligations as an occupying power, stemming from the Geneva Conventions, which were adopted 75 years ago. Ironically, the conventions were adopted to a large extent to protect the Jewish people, which were subjected to inhuman suffering during World War II, and also adopted to avert any future prosecution based on nationality as well. Israel, without a doubt, has the right to ensure its security. However, the path to such security undoubtedly lies solely via a comprehensive Middle East settlement process and by remedying the historical injustice visited upon the Palestinian people by establishing an independent Palestinian state as per relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. We've been convinced time and again that any other unilateral formula geared towards achieving a truce between Israel and its neighbors without a just solution of the Palestinian question won't help achieve the aforementioned goal. All such schemes will do is prompt outbreaks of violence like the one underway in the region right now. Madam President, we've stated many times that we stand against violence and terrorism in all of its manifestations. We stand attacks on civilians anywhere, in any country. This also applies to the attack on peaceable Israelis on 7th October 2023, which we immediately and unequivocally condemned. Nothing justifies such actions. just like there's nothing that can justify what's underway in Gaza, a collective punishment and the total annihilation of the civilian population. We stand convinced that the current catastrophic situation can and should be settled solely through political and diplomatic ways. To this end, we need to ensure the implementation of relevant Security Council resolutions to immediately stop the bloodshed in the region and, what's most important, to guarantee the implementation of the lawful right of Palestinians to their own state based on 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. We must act without delay. We must compel the parties to the conflict to an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, coupled with an exchange of hostages and detainees and a full and unfettered humanitarian access to the Strip. This will not only help restart the process of peaceful settlement of the Palestinian question using the two states for two people formula, which we've all unswervingly supported, but it will also help to de-escalate tensions throughout the Middle East. Regrettably, the Resolution 2735, adopted in June at the insistence of our US colleagues, cannot achieve a ceasefire because it hinges on the outcome of a somewhat dubious negotiation process which isn't actually underway at present. We'd like to believe that Washington will at last recognize this obvious fact and will stop sabotaging relevant Security Council initiatives in future. We stand ready to support any such initiatives. I'd like to remind you that the Security Council has levers and necessary and time-tested toolkits to tackle these tasks. We're all very familiar with such toolkits. All we need to do is to muster the political will to finally set aside narrow geopolitical interests and to clearly and unambiguously demand an immediate ceasefire. We see that all Security Council members, bar one, are ready to do so. We don't understand why the remaining members of the Security Council have to share responsibility for the madness underway in Gaza, if it is only one member that's stopping us from ending this madness. So we'd like to ask all those who will be taking the floor after we do not to limit themselves to general appeals to the Security Council, but to personalize their reproaches, addressing it to the state which is personally responsible. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I invite the representative of Ecuador to take the floor. Thank you, Madam President. Allow me to begin by thanking the acting USG for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Ms. Joyce Masuya. I thank her for the sober report with which we have just been furnished. Ecuador reiterates its unwavering support for UNRWA's work. President, as we have heard, hostilities continue, and the humanitarian situation, which was already extremely difficult, is worsening yet further still, particularly in the north of the Strip. This Council, through its resolutions, has called for the adequate and timely delivery of humanitarian aid, and has provided even for the creation of a mechanism to ease and expedite the entry of that aid into and its distribution in Gaza that should be implemented without restrictions. The adoption of immediate measures which would guarantee the provision of basic services and humanitarian aid was also ordered by the International Court of Justice in the provisional measures handed down at the beginning of this year. The senior humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator for Gaza has been working since January and has presented to the Council periodic reports on her work. The requirement that she continue to do so was extended only a few weeks ago with the support of all Council members. However, in order to implement the mandates and resolutions, the expressions of support will not suffice. It is crucial that we see political will of all parties. Above all, what we need is a ceasefire in Gaza. As such, we must ensure compliance with Resolution 2735, a resolution which calls for the immediate ceasefire, the release of hostages, and the delivery of humanitarian aid in an adequate and timely fashion. As I indicated last week, Madam President, this crisis does not only demand an urgent response, rather it also requires sustained support on the part of the international community to alleviate the suffering and of the Israelis and Palestinians and protect their fundamental human rights. We must also crucially bear in mind that respecting the norms of international humanitarian law is not optional, neither does it depend on reciprocity. Breaking international law has grave international responsibilities which we cannot ignore. Today, however, we have heard about forced displacements, the impediments to humanitarian access, and famine in the north of Gaza. All of this runs counter to international humanitarian law. Consequently, we should today recall that the Security Council resolutions and orders of the International Court of Justice must be upheld always, without exception, in this and in all cases. Colleagues, I wish to conclude this statement by reiterating my country's condemnation of the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023. Those attacks were the immediate cause of the current violence. I reiterate our demand that all hostages be immediately and unconditionally released. I wish to conclude reaffirming Ecuador's commitment to working towards a peaceful, lasting and just solution for the parties, with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, on the basis of 1967 lines and relevant resolutions. Thank you. I thank the representative of Ecuador, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank Acting USG Musia for her update on the grim reality on the ground. The situation in Gaza remains desperate, with no end in sight. We are now entering a second year of devastation since the horrific attack by Hamas and others on October 7th. Japan once again firmly condemns the attack and the hostage-taking of Hamas and demands that all remaining hostages be immediately released. Madam President, Japan is deeply disturbed by the intensifying Israeli military activities in Gaza in recent days, particularly in the north. We are appalled by the reports that attacks on displacement camps, schools, and even hospitals have led to hundreds of casualties, including many women and children. The reports that hundreds of thousands of people are still trapped in this very dangerous situation in northern Gaza are profoundly alarming. They have nowhere to go amidst the continued bombardment and little access to humanitarian aid, facing an imminent risk of starvation. Moreover, Israel's repeated evacuation orders have pushed the Palestinians in northern Gaza to the south, causing yet another massive displacement. We amplify our strong demand that all parties to the conflict must act in accordance with the international law, including international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian objects must be protected, and safe and unhindered access to humanitarian aid must be guaranteed at all times. Madam President, one glimmer hope is the success of the second round of the polio vaccination campaign so far. We are grateful to the UN agencies and personnel involved while taking note of the coordination efforts by COGAT. We urge all parties to ensure the campaign can be safely completed so that this disease no longer threatens the children of Gaza and the region. The vaccination effort demonstrates two things. First, it shows what can be achieved when the parties work together to save innocent civilians rather than keeping them in the crossfire and depriving them of basic human necessities and dignity. Second, it shows the indispensable role that UNRWA is playing on the ground. The agency must be allowed to operate. We again expressed our grave concern about the bills proposed in the Israeli Knesset that would undermine its work and jeopardize essential services for millions of vulnerable Palestinian refugees. Madam President, as we all know, only a ceasefire can end this humanitarian catastrophe. The deal outlined in the Security Council Resolution 2735 would allow for the release of all hostages, immediate ceasefire, and delivery of humanitarian aid to Palestinians at scale. It has been on the table for months, and the importance of this resolution remains unchanged. We strongly hope that tireless mediation efforts of the United States, Egypt, and Qatar would persuade the parties to finally accept and implement it straight away. A ceasefire and release of hostages are absolute prerequisite for the cessation of the ongoing human tragedies. What we see in front of us are not inevitable facts. They are human-made tragedies. All concerned actors must work relentlessly to bring a halt to the fighting. Japan will spare no diplomatic effort to that end. I thank you, Madam
Je
President.
remercie le représentant du Japon.
I thank the representative of Japan. I will now make a statement as the representative of Switzerland.
Mes collègues.
Much like my colleagues before me, I'd like to thank the Acting Undersecretary General of OCHA, Ms. Msuya, for her briefing on the catastrophic situation in Gaza. And this in all the fundamental areas: food security, health, and education. The level of suffering is difficult to capture in words. That is what Ms. Msuya said. I think that will stay with us. By way of introduction, and this is also what I will say in conclusion, there must be an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, something the Council has been calling for months. Distinguished colleagues, our Algerian colleague already mentioned this. Today we're commemorating the 78th anniversary of the foundation of the FAO and International Food Day. The FAO eradicated hunger and improved food security in many countries. Tragically, in Gaza, this day serves as a somber reminder. Famine is threatening the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, first and foremost children. Switzerland would like to recall that Resolution 2417, adopted by the Security Council, strongly condemns, and here I quote, the unlawful denial of humanitarian access and the deprivation of civilians of objects indispensable to their survival, end of quote. The Rome Statute considers the use of starvation as a method of warfare to be a war crime, and states that those responsible must be brought to justice. In Gaza, civilians, including nearly 400,000 people in the northern Gaza Strip, only have international humanitarian law to shield behind. It's therefore essential for the parties to implement this law. The threats facing these civilians are facing are terrifying. Schools have become shelters and they're being bombed. That was the case with Jabalia last weekend. The same applies to hospital complexes. The almost total denial of humanitarian aid is exposing civilians to epidemics of a bygone era, not to mention the fact that children haven't gone to school for over a year now. This compels us to confront a number of questions. Is the delivery of humanitarian aid aimed at combating food security among Gaza's population? Are these deliveries being deliberately obstructed? Are the new evacuation orders issued by Israel to hundreds and thousands of men, women, and children, are they an attempt to introduce permanent changes in the occupied Palestinian territory? Switzerland would like to remind everyone that such measures would be illegal under international humanitarian law. Having said that, Hamas continues to fire rockets at Israel, including as far as Tel Aviv. This we condemn. The humanitarian situation of the hostages who are still alive is also catastrophic. We strongly condemn these atrocious acts of terror committed by Hamas on October 7th. We also called for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. We will continue to do so. We've said it time and time again. All of the parties, including Hamas and other armed groups in the Gaza Strip, must uphold international humanitarian law. However, Hamas's vile crimes in no way suspend Israel's obligation to unswervingly comply with international humanitarian law. Israel must urgently and vigorously take effective measures to provide basic services and emergency humanitarian aid to Palestinians in Gaza, as required by the International Court of Justice. We'd like to recall that this is an obligation under international humanitarian law. To this end, only close collaboration between Israel and specialized humanitarian agencies can help ensure the safe, rapid, and unfettered delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians in need. Switzerland applauds the work of these agencies, including UNRWA, the WHO, and UNICEF. The agencies which carried out the first phase of polio vaccinations, and this under extremely difficult conditions over the last month. Humanitarian agencies must be able to operate in a safe humanitarian space so as to conduct their work, including the second phase of the vaccination campaign scheduled this week. The attacks faced by humanitarian workers during hostilities, but also in the media, are unacceptable. The Security Council has unanimously reaffirmed its support for the Secretary General and UN personnel, including humanitarian and peacekeeping personnel. who are operating under these particularly hostile conditions. Given the massive escalation of violence in the occupied Palestinian territory and the wider region, respect for international humanitarian law and the implementation of Security Council resolutions are fundamental and indispensable milestones for de-escalation on the path to peace. Peace must be based on a two-state solution. So once again, let me repeat what I said earlier. There must be an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, as the Security Council has been calling for months now. This must happen now. Switzerland stands ready to engage with other members of the Council, working together to take the necessary steps to achieve this. I thank you.
I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, I want to thank Algeria for asking for the urgent convening of this meeting on behalf of the Arab group. And we also want to thank you and the members of the Security Council for your swift convening of this meeting. And also I want to add my voice to all of you who have thanked the briefing of the acting USG of OCHA. Madam President, the genocide is underway in the Gaza Strip. Israel feels more emboldened than ever, and the Palestinian people and the Lebanese people are paying with their lives the price of this impunity. There is no rule Israel did not break. There is no red line Israel did not cross. And it is yet to be held accountable for any of it. It is this impunity, while committing atrocities, that explains Israel's latest plan to achieve what has been its goal all along. We warned since the first days of the Israeli assault that its goal was forcible displacement of the Palestinian people and annexation of the Palestinian territory. What we are seeing in northern Gaza is exactly that. 400,000 Palestinians besieged and bombed and starved, left with a choice: to stay in the north and die in the bombings or from starvation, or leave to face death elsewhere. The so-called general's plan, Israeli general's plan, is in motion. Any Palestinian that stays in the north is considered a legitimate military target. All are hostages and bargaining chips. That is not war. I repeat, this is not war. These are crimes. This is genocide. They must be stopped, and they must be stopped now. Madam President, Israel is repeating the same pattern over and over again. Deny protected status to all those that international law were enacted to protect, notably civilians, including children and humanitarians. Deny humanitarian aid, including the most vital for the survival of the population. Destroy all civilian infrastructure and all conditions of life. Displace the population over and over and over again, while making sure they have nowhere to go and that anywhere and everywhere they go, they are not safe. Kill at will and explain that it is never your fault. Madam President, look at what Israel did with UNIFIL. We told you to leave. If you stay, you can be attacked. Outrageous argument, and yet that is what happened repeatedly. And that is what the Israeli Prime Minister and war criminal said himself. So if they can use this argument against a UN force deployed and mandated by this council, what chance do Palestinian and now Lebanese civilians stand when faced with the same logic? Leave or turn into a legitimate military target. Leave or die, and very often leave and die. Israel has declared an all-out war against the Palestinian people, and its attacks against the UN are an integral part of this war. To destroy the conditions of life in Gaza, Israel needs to make sure no one can help restore them, even minimally. Israel's attack against UNRWA is part of its assault against the Palestine refugees it serves and the Palestinian civilian population it is trying to help survive. It is genocide. Cold-blooded, planned, and executed genocide for the perpetrators. Burning, terrifying, harrowing genocide for the victims. What is happening in northern Gaza now is another level of monstrosity. Silence and inaction are not an option. Are you ready to proclaim that while Palestinians refuse to surrender, even when faced with collective capital punishment, this council decided to surrender? We know that many members around this table refuse to do so, and we count on them today to fight back with the tools provided by the Charter and by the law to combat those who are obliterating the Charter and the law. This is the responsibility of the Council and of each and every state around the world. The matter is straightforward, plain and simple. The massacres have to stop. Cease fire now. No delay and no condition. And life-saving assistance must immediately reach the civilian population in Gaza, notably northern Gaza. No delay and no excuses. The measure of our success is the lives we save. Madam President, you all see the bombardments and the destruction, the famine, and the denial of humanitarian aid, while Israel explains it is upholding the principles of distinction and proportionality and showing photos of trucks entering Gaza. Absurdity meets inhumanity. By now, you all know Israeli lies. You all know Israel is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. By now, you are witnesses of the genocide, whether you recognize it yet or will recognize it later. Enough is enough. Enough is enough. Let me be clear. A member of these United Nations that has committed such egregious, repeated, and prolonged breaches of its charter, that has committed such atrocities, and that has attacked the UN, declaring the Secretary General persona non grata, that has killed and maimed UN staff and attacked UN headquarters and shelters and is openly attempting to destroy a UN agency and continuously inciting against the UN, and that now has added attacking UN peacekeepers to the list, such a member has nothing to do among us and has already surrendered its membership by violating every single obligation and commitment that comes with it. We are not powerless. This Council is not powerless. These United Nations are not powerless. The international community is not powerless. To the brutal use of force, we must respond with the full force of the law. To the brutal use of force, we must respond with the full force of the law. Hundreds of thousands of lives hang in the balance. The future of our region hangs in the balance. The future of our international law-based order hangs in the balance. The safety of millions of civilians in the region hangs in the balance. Regional and international peace and security hang in the balance. This is worth fighting for. Don't surrender to the fire. Don't surrender to the arsonist. It is time to fight back, or the whole region will go up in flames. Humanity must prevail over this inhumanity. And for the record, let me state once again, we are for the protection of all civilians and against harming any civilian. But Palestinian civilians are not less civilian, and their lives are not less worthy of protection. We want a Middle East where all states live in peace and security, but that must include the Palestinian state. We want peace, but the only path to peace is through freedom for the Palestinian people and respect for their right to self-determination. We are for respect for international law by all and for the benefit of all. Stop the genocide. Stop the genocide. End this occupation-made famine and humanitarian crisis. Let people return to where their homes once stood and their communities once lived, to resume their lives and rebuild what can be, to mourn and try to restore life. Free prisoners and hostages. Let families reunite in life and not death, and let them try to the extent possible to heal. Help us chart a path away from occupation and wars. Help us achieve freedom, justice, and peace, so these horrors can never occur again. Never again. It is time to act. Anything else is complicity and surrender. The Palestinian people enduring hell did not surrender. Neither should you. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. 376 days since the largest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. For 376 days, 101 human beings, men, women, children, elderly, have been tormented by Hamas terrorists in their terror dungeons. Over the weekend, another brutal assault struck Israel. A Hezbollah drone attacked the northern city of Binyamina, leaving over 60 injured and claiming the lives of 4 of our bravest heroes. Just days later, on Tuesday, a terrorist opened fire on a crowd of civilians near Yavne in the center of Israel, murdering a police officer and injuring 4 others. It was only through the heroic actions of an armed civilian nearby that this did not become a massacre on an unimaginable scale. While we confronted terrorists on the ground, Hezbollah launched 320 missiles and drones on Yom Kippur, the holiest day for the Jewish people, hitting a nursing home in central Israel in the city of Herzliya. Today we are discussing the humanitarian situation in Gaza, while Israeli civilians are being targeted daily by those who seek our destruction. The Council has managed to convene just a single session on our hostages in 376 days, a small gesture considering the suffering and loss we continue to endure. And still, so many Council members barely mention the hostages as an afterthought, if at all. Hirsch Goldberg, Pauline's mother, Rachel, spoke of the conditions they found their son, along with the 5 other hostages who were executed by Hamas with bullets to the back of their head. She revealed that, and I quote, "He had bullet wounds in his shoulder, neck, and back of the head. He was found collapsed on his knees with 24-year-old hostage Eden Yerushalmi leaning on his lap. Throughout the tunnel were bottles filled with very dark urine, an airless, completely pitch-black tunnel with no plumbing. We have been clear time and time again. Hamas must release their hostages immediately and unconditionally and lay down their arms. If any of you truly wish to see change, join us in these demands. To those who believe there is no more work to be done to protect civilians from murderous terrorists in Gaza, you are sorely mistaken. Only days ago, our forces discovered an arsenal of weapons and explosives inside an UNRWA clinic. Cloaked in the blue flag of the UN, terrorists have seized this facility, using it as a weapon store and a launch site. How many times have we warned of UNRWA Gaza's infiltration by Hamas? How many months have passed since we provided a list of hundreds of names of Hamas terrorists employed by UNRWA? No reply. Colleagues, while we confront the ongoing threat in Gaza, along with the 6 other fronts from which we are continually attacked, our humanitarian efforts remained as comprehensive as ever. Just days ago, we successfully transferred patients and staff from a hospital in Jabalia to another facility in coordination with the Red Cross and the UN. In recent days, we have transferred 70,000 liters of fuel to hospitals and facilitated 800 blood transfusions. 14 field hospitals have been established in Gaza, and 30,000 tons of medicine and supplies have entered. As always, we acted in accordance with international law, going above and beyond our obligations. We remain committed to facilitating humanitarian aid, especially in the medical field, despite Hamas's efforts to embed themselves among medical staff and patients. And I encourage you to look online. You can see the videos where Hamas actually disguise themselves to be UN employees. You can see them putting the vest, the helmets. Only 72 hours ago, the second polio vaccination campaign began in collaboration with UNICEF and WHO. In the first day of the second stage, more than 92,000 children under the age of 10 were vaccinated, while a further 76,000 received vitamin supplement treatment. These numbers are in addition to the more than 500,000 who were vaccinated in the first campaign across Gaza. These efforts are in response to our rising needs, and additional to the more than 1 million tons of aid delivered into Gaza, of which 700,000 is food aid. On October 14 alone, over 108 trucks entered Gaza via the Kerem Shalom and Erez crossing. All the while, 530 trucks filled with aid are awaiting collection inside Gaza. Pay attention to that. The problem is not only is in our side. 500 trucks are now waiting inside Gaza. There are other issues to be addressed. Council members, Israel has flooded Gaza with as much aid as possible. Humanitarian aid trucks continue to enter Gaza, and we appreciate our international partners for their assistance. With hundreds of aid trucks waiting to be distributed inside Gaza, while others are hijacked and diverted by Hamas, this session has entirely missed the real issue at hand. The issue in Gaza is not a lack of aid. More than enough aid has entered to sustain every civilian in Gaza, with over 1 million tons delivered since the war began. Yet, the challenges continue. Yes, we admit that. And it's not due to Israel's efforts or failure to deliver humanitarian assistance. The real issue is Hamas. This terrorist organization has hijacked the aid, seizing it for their own purposes. They steal, they store, and even sell the aid that is intended for Gaza's civilians, turning humanitarian relief into a profit machine. Instead of feeding the hungry or caring for the sick, Hamas uses the supplies to feed their terror machine. Hamas's exploitation of international goodwill is not new, but the scale of their corruption and violence against their own people is staggering. Aid that should be in the hands of families in need is instead being funneled into the pockets of terrorists, with supplies either stored in secret caches or sold on the black market to enrich their leaders. Hamas has favored their terrorists over the civilians they claim to defend, choosing to sustain their terrorist activities while leaving the people of Gaza to fend for themselves. Israel, along with our international partners, continue to flood Gaza with aid, but it will never reach all those in need as long as Hamas remains in power. Hamas has weaponized the humanitarian situation, exploiting every opportunity to strengthen their hold while their own people suffer. This makes it incredibly difficult to ensure that the aid reaches its intended recipients. And I know you all spoke about Israel, but you can speak maybe after in the consultation about the challenges, what happens to the trucks after they enter Gaza, where they try to reach the destinations, the storage areas. Israel remains committed to working with our partners to deliver humanitarian assistance, even under these dangerous and morally reprehensible conditions. As I've said before, it is far easier to criticize the democratic nation defending itself than to hold the terrorists accountable. But what is easy is rarely right. Hamas moves through evacuation routes, hides in humanitarian zones, and uses civilians as human shields. Madam President, I envision a future Gaza, one where aid reaches those it is intended for, where humanitarian agencies are not fronts for terrorists, and where the people of Gaza can live without fear of Hamas. I know that many Council members share this vision, but it cannot be realized with Hamas in power. We will not wait for another October 7. We will not wait while Hamas plots our destruction. We will act, and we will act with the principles and morals that guide our nation. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. I invite the representative of Mauritania to take the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I'd like to thank Madam Misuya for her briefing. Madam President, the Arab group thanks you for holding this meeting to resume our discussion on the situation in the Middle East, including the question of Palestine. We would also like to thank Algeria for requesting this meeting, which is being held just 1 week after the Council met to discuss the same item and the same topic. But the Council once again failed to take effective action to put an end to the ongoing war of genocide against unarmed civilians in the Gaza Strip. We come back again as we witness escalating developments on the ground in the Gaza Strip. And as we see rising numbers of rising numbers of victims among civilians, children, women, and the elderly. As we see a confirmation of the intentions of the occupying power, and as the international community and this council continue to remain silent. Israel, over the past few days, has continued the usual type of massacres that have killed over 200 unarmed Palestinians. In the past few days, they were slaughtered in the streets, they were burnt in the hospitals, and they were buried under the rubble of residential buildings. And the occupying forces seem to take pleasure in the suffering of the victims as Israel continues to issue orders for evacuation so that it would isolate the residents of the Gaza Strip in certain areas so that it could exterminate them completely. This is in parallel with the occupying forces' focus in their barbaric attack on the northern part of Gaza, where more than 400,000 children, women, and men are in danger as the occupation forces continue to besiege the Jabalia refugee camp in an operation that aims to kill systematically and continuously as the world watches. And as this open war of genocide rages, we see the specter of a sure famine looming over the residents of the Gaza Strip who are sleeping under the sky, who are sleeping on the rubble of their homes with a total absence of basic services and water and food and medicine. Israel continues its intensive efforts to completely erase the UNRWA by launching attacks and making baseless accusations against it. This means that those who are lucky enough to survive the Israeli killing machine will face death by famine and disease over the next few days and weeks. This esteemed council must stop this war of genocide through an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. We must guarantee urgent humanitarian aid and access of this aid to the residents. We must guarantee a return to the negotiating table as soon as possible to achieve a comprehensive and lasting peace. Madam President, the victims of this war of genocide number at almost 43,000 dead and 100,000 injured as this war enters its second year. And as we've said before, putting an end to this war is not simply a humanitarian imperative. Rather, it is a means for this council to prove its credibility and effectiveness, as well as the effectiveness of the collective security system as a whole upon which this organization was built. Or else, wars will continue to spread throughout the world, starting with the Middle East, and no one would be able to stop them because the mechanism to do so would be absent and dismissed, and credibility would have eroded and diminished. In closing, the Arab group demands a stop to the Israeli aggression on Palestine and Lebanon. We demand a stop to the repeated Israeli attacks on Syria. We demand immediate measures to deter the occupying entity as it continues in its criminal doctrine based on killing and bloodshed, the killing and bloodshed of civilians, and spreading destruction and chaos and threatening peace and security in the region. This regime must be held responsible for these crimes, and it must not escape punishment. The group of Arab states stresses the need to implement relevant United Nations resolutions to end the Israeli occupation of Arab territory in Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mauritania. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.